I was standing in my own kitchen when my daughter screamed, "Do not touch that food. It is for my in laws." In that moment, something inside me cracked. I had paid for the groceries, I had helped pay for the house, yet somehow I was the outsider. That sentence was not about dinner, it was about erasure. It was the night I realized I was being pushed out of a home I helped build, and the night I decided I would never be treated like a guest in my own life again. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I am 72 years old, a retired registered nurse who spent more than 35 years working 12-hour shifts in a hospital in Eugene, Oregon. For nearly 4 decades, I lived in the same cedar-sided house at the edge of town, where the winters were damp and green and the summers smelled like pine and river water. That house held my marriage, my grief, and every version of myself I had ever been. When my husband, Thomas, died from pancreatic cancer, the rooms did not feel smaller. They felt endless. In the months after his funeral, I kept making coffee for 2 out of habit. I would set his mug on the kitchen table before remembering there was no one left to drink it. The refrigerator hummed too loudly at night. The hallway echoed when I walked from the bedroom to the living room. I told myself I was strong. I had survived emergency rooms, loss, and long nights beside dying patients. But there is a difference between strength at work and silence at home. The silence began to press against my chest. My daughter, Linda Whitmore Keller, called more often that year. She lived in Scottsdale, Arizona, where the sky stretched wide and dry over neighborhoods lined with palm trees. Linda worked as a real estate agent and liked to describe the desert as opportunity. She told me she worried about me living alone. She said I should come down, be closer to family, enjoy my grandchildren while I still had the energy. She and her husband Daniel owned a large Spanish Revival-style home with a generous backyard. There was room, she insisted, to build a small casita just for me. She painted the picture carefully. The casita would have its own entrance, a small kitchenette, and a shaded patio. I would have independence without loneliness. She promised my name would be included in the family living trust, so I would be protected. "We will all take care of each other," she said once, her voice warm and certain. I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. When I sold my Oregon house for $410,000, I felt as if I were closing a chapter written in ink. From the proceeds, I gave Linda $80,000 to help build the casita and pay down part of their mortgage. I did not ask for complicated contracts or demand detailed explanations. I signed the trust documents she placed in front of me without studying every page. I told myself this was not a business transaction. This was family. Packing up my life took longer than I expected. I wrapped photo albums in towels. I boxed up my nursing certificates. I brought my favorite kitchen utensils and the ceramic mixing bowl I had used every Thanksgiving. I loaded my car with potted plants that had survived Oregon winters on my porch. When I crossed into Arizona, the landscape shifted from evergreen to sand and red rock. The air felt sharper, almost metallic in its dryness. I kept telling myself this was the beginning of a gentler season. The first weeks in Scottsdale were full of movement. Contractors came and went. The casitas slowly took shape behind the main house. Linda hugged me often. Daniel thanked me for helping them get ahead. I cooked dinners, watched my grandchildren after school, and watered the desert plants in the evenings. I contributed to utilities and groceries without being asked. I felt useful again, woven into the rhythm of a household. Standing in the backyard one evening, watching the sun drop behind the distant mountains, I told myself I had done the right thing. I believed I had invested not only money, but love, into a future where I would never again sit alone in the dark. I did not know that the decision I made out of trust would one day force me to question what family truly meant. If you are still watching, and you can already feel that something is not right beneath the surface, comment number 1 below so I know you are paying attention. Now let us move into chapter 2, where the first real crack begins to show. A few months after I moved to Scottsdale, life began to settle into something that looked, from the outside, like stability. The casita was finished, painted the same warm sand color as the main house. I arranged my furniture carefully, placing my old armchair near the window that faced the backyard. Each morning, I watered the desert plants and told myself I had made the right decision. I was not alone anymore. I was part of a household again. The dinner with Daniel's parents was planned a week in advance. They were driving in from Phoenix, and Linda wanted everything to look perfect. She cleaned the main house from top to bottom, rearranged decorative pillows, and polished the kitchen counters until they gleamed. I went to the grocery store with her and quietly paid for several items when she hesitated at the total. The receipt was longer than my hand. Salmon, imported cheese, specialty bread, wine I could not pronounce. I told myself it was nice to contribute. All afternoon I helped in the kitchen. I chopped vegetables, set the table, and watched Linda move with nervous energy. Daniel paced in and out, checking the time, adjusting his shirt sleeves, asking whether the good glasses had been washed. I sensed that this dinner was more than a meal. It was a performance. I tried to stay in the background, careful not to interrupt whatever image they were constructing. By early evening, the kitchen smelled of garlic and rosemary. I realized I had not eaten since breakfast. Thinking no one would mind, I opened the refrigerator to cut a small piece of cheese and slice a bit of bread. I had paid for some of that food, but that did not cross my mind in that moment. I was simply hungry. Linda turned around sharply when she heard the refrigerator door. Her voice cut through the room before I even saw her face. "Do not touch that food. That is food for Daniel's parents." The words were loud, sharp, and final. The air seemed to collapse inward. I stood there with my hand on the refrigerator shelf, unsure whether I had misunderstood her. Daniel was behind her, silent. He did not soften her tone or correct her. He simply watched. In that stillness, I felt something shift beneath my feet. It was not about the cheese. It was not about the bread. It was about territory. I closed the refrigerator slowly and stepped back. I told her I understood. My voice sounded distant to my own ears. I walked out of the kitchen, through the sliding glass door, and across the yard to the casita. The sky above the desert was turning violet, and laughter drifted from the main house as Daniel's parents arrived. I heard greetings, the clink of glasses, the hum of polite conversation. I did not join them. I sat in my small living room, the lights dim, listening to the faint echo of celebration next door. I realized I had never been formally included in the dinner plan. No one had said I should sit at the table. No one had asked where I would be. I was an accessory to preparation, not a participant in the event. As the evening wore on, I thought about my kitchen in Oregon, where no one would have told me I needed permission to eat. I thought about the $80,000 I had given, the trust document I had signed without studying every clause. A quiet question began forming in my mind, one that would not let me rest. If I could not open a refrigerator in this house without being corrected, what else did I not truly own? If you are still here and starting to sense that trust is about to be tested, comment number 2 below to let me know you are with me. Now let us step into chapter 3, where everything begins to shift. The night Linda told me not to touch the food lingered in my mind like a low fever. I lay awake in the casita listening to the faint hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of traffic from the main road. One question repeated itself with stubborn clarity. What else in this house did I believe was mine that truly was not? The thought unsettled me more than the sharpness of her voice. It was not about hurt feelings anymore. It was about ownership. A few days later, when Linda and Daniel left for work, the house felt unusually still. I walked through the main kitchen to wipe down the counters, something I had done countless times before. On the dining table sat a thin stack of financial papers. I did not intend to pry. I had never been the kind of person to read other people's mail. But my eyes caught the property address printed in bold at the top of the page. Beneath it was a mortgage statement. I hesitated, then picked it up. The document listed the borrowers clearly: Linda Whitmore Keller and Daniel Keller. I read the names twice, as if expecting mine to appear lower on the page in smaller print. It did not. My name, Margaret Whitmore, was nowhere on the statement. A chill spread through my arms. I told myself this might be normal. Perhaps my name appeared somewhere else, in another document, under a different structure. Back in the casita, I opened my laptop and searched the public records website for Maricopa County Recorder. The site allowed anyone to search property ownership by address. My fingers moved slowly across the keyboard. When the results loaded, the listed owners were the same two names I had just seen. There was no third name, no notation of shared ownership, no sign that I had ever contributed a single dollar to the purchase of this house. I confronted Linda that evening, trying to keep my voice calm. I told her I had noticed my name was not on the mortgage. She answered quickly, saying it was a temporary structure for financing purposes. She reminded me that I was protected under the Family Living Trust and that everything was set up to benefit all of us. Her explanation was smooth but vague. She did not show me any documents to confirm it. I nodded, yet something inside me refused to settle. That night, I retrieved the copy of the trust document I had signed months earlier. Until then, I had treated it like a formality. I brewed a cup of tea and began reading every page carefully for the first time. Legal language stretched across paragraph after paragraph, dense and impersonal. When I reached the section listing beneficiaries, my heart tightened. I was not named as a beneficiary. Instead, I was described as a family contributor. There were no voting rights attached to my name, no clear legal claim to the property. My hands trembled slightly as I closed the document. I remembered that Daniel sometimes printed emails using the shared wireless printer connected to my laptop when the office printer malfunctioned. I searched the recent print history stored in the system. Among ordinary invoices and appointment reminders was a saved email thread. I opened it and found a message Daniel had sent to a financial advisor. In it, he wrote that once they restructured the trust, I would have zero claim to the property. The words blurred for a moment before sharpening into focus. This was not confusion. It was not a misunderstanding about paperwork. It was deliberate. I sat back in my chair and felt the weight of clarity settle over me. I had not simply overlooked a detail. I had been excluded from the very beginning. I was living in a house I had helped finance. Yet, legally, I did not exist within it. If you are still watching and wondering just how deep this betrayal goes, comment number 3 below, so I know you are staying with the story. Now let us continue to chapter 4, where the pressure starts to rise. After reading Daniel's email, something inside me settled into a cold, steady clarity. I did not confront them again. I did not cry. I had spent too many years in hospital corridors watching families fall apart under pressure to confuse panic with action. Instead, I began gathering information. I returned to the Maricopa County Recorder website and searched deeper into the property filings. That was when I saw it. A second mortgage recorded only 3 months after my $80,000 contribution had been deposited. The amount was substantial, far larger than what would have been needed for the casita. I searched business records and found Daniel's startup company, recently struggling according to public filings. The pieces aligned quickly. If that business failed and the lender foreclosed, the entire property would be at risk. The casita I had funded would disappear along with any illusion of security. I would not simply be excluded. I would be erased financially. The fear that rose in me was different from humiliation. It was practical. I could survive emotional rejection. I could not survive losing everything at 72 years old. That afternoon, I searched for an attorney specializing in elder financial abuse in Arizona. The name Susan Delgado appeared repeatedly in reviews and legal forums. Her office was located in a modest building in central Scottsdale. It was not glamorous, but it was established. I called and scheduled a consultation. When I hung up the phone, my hands were steady. Driving to her office felt surreal. I had once been the parent who handled scraped knees and broken hearts. Now, I was walking into a lawyer's office to discuss protecting myself from my own daughter. The receptionist led me into a small conference room where sunlight filtered through blinds onto a polished wooden table. Susan Delgado listened without interrupting as I described the trust, the mortgage, the second loan, and Daniel's email stating I would have zero claim once the restructuring was complete. When I finished, she folded her hands and explained that Arizona law recognizes undue influence and financial exploitation of vulnerable adults. She said that if my contribution had been made under the promise of shared protection, and that promise had been manipulated, I had grounds to challenge the trust structure. She outlined the possibility of seeking rescission of the trust terms and full reimbursement of my funds. Her tone was calm, clinical, not emotional. I asked her directly whether I had a real case. She responded that documentation would determine everything. The email, the mortgage filings, and my financial transfer records would be critical. She advised me to preserve every document and avoid alerting my daughter until we were prepared. Over the next week, I printed copies of Daniel's email, downloaded official property records, and organized bank statements showing the $80,000 transfer. I saved screenshots of the second mortgage filing and stored duplicates in a secure folder. I even recorded conversations when Linda casually mentioned future financial adjustments, making sure not to provoke, but simply to document. When Susan prepared the formal complaint to file with Maricopa County Superior Court, I read every line carefully. The filing requested nullification of the trust provisions that excluded me and demanded reimbursement of my contribution. Signing the complaint felt heavier than signing any medical chart I had ever completed. This signature was not routine. It was a line in the sand. The papers were served 3 days later. Daniel's reaction was immediate and hostile. He confronted me in the driveway, accusing me of trying to destroy their stability. Linda's voice trembled with anger when she said I was tearing the family apart. Daniel threatened to cut off electricity to the casita if I did not withdraw the complaint. I did not raise my voice. I did not apologize. I simply told them that the matter would proceed through legal channels. That evening, alone in my small living room, I realized something had shifted permanently. For decades, I had been the one protecting others. Now, I was protecting myself. The tears I might have shed months earlier no longer came. In their place stood resolve. If you are still here and feeling the tension build, comment number 4 below to show you are locked in. Now, let us move into Chapter 5, where the situation explodes in ways no one expected. Once the complaint was officially filed with Maricopa County Superior Court, the atmosphere in the house changed in ways that were impossible to ignore. The polite distance that had existed before hardened into open hostility. Linda stopped knocking on the casita door. Daniel avoided eye contact unless it was to glare. The backyard, once shared space, felt divided by invisible borders. The first real blow did not come in person. It came online. One evening, as I scrolled through Facebook, I saw Linda's latest post. She wrote about protecting my peace and learning to distance herself from toxic manipulation, even when it came from people who should support you. The message did not mention my name, but it did not need to. The comments poured in quickly. Friends praised her strength. Some wrote about setting boundaries with difficult relatives. A few hinted at how exhausting it must be to deal with someone who refuses to let go. I read every word without responding. The narrative was being shaped without me, casting me as a controlling mother who had changed her mind about a generous gift. I could feel how easily the story traveled, how quickly sympathy aligned with youth and presentation. I had no desire to argue publicly. I knew that whatever I wrote would only fuel the performance. Daniel's parents called 2 days later. His mother spoke sharply, accusing me of destabilizing the household and jeopardizing the future of my grandchildren. She said lawsuits tear families apart and that decent people handle matters privately. I listened in silence. No one asked what documents I had seen or why I felt compelled to act. In their version of events, I was the aggressor. Inside the house, tension thickened. Meals were no longer shared. When I entered the main kitchen, conversations stopped. Daniel began parking his car in a way that partially blocked the path to the casita, a petty reminder of territory. Linda moved with a cool detachment, speaking only when necessary. I was no longer a mother. I was a liability. Amid that hostility, Susan Delgado uncovered something more troubling. During routine financial discovery, she located records showing that Daniel had transferred certain assets into a limited liability company recently formed under his parents' names. The timing coincided with the filing of my complaint. The implication was unmistakable. He was attempting to shield assets from potential court judgments. When Susan explained this to me, her tone remained measured. She said that if proven intentional, the transfer could constitute fraudulent conveyance. The case might expand beyond a simple trust dispute into broader financial misconduct. I felt a quiet, grim understanding settle over me. This was no impulsive oversight. It was strategy. Daniel confronted me one evening in the driveway, stating that if I won, they could lose the house entirely. Linda later said I was pushing their marriage to the edge. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke. If I continued, I would be responsible for their collapse. For a moment, guilt pressed against me. I remembered her as a child, clinging to my hand on her first day of kindergarten. But guilt does not erase facts. The mortgage records, the trust language, the email declaring I would have zero claim, and now the asset transfers all pointed in one direction. This was not about misunderstanding. It was about... The morning of the hearing at Maricopa County Superior Court arrived without ceremony. The sky above Scottsdale was pale and cloudless, as if the day had no interest in the outcome that felt so enormous to me. I dressed carefully, choosing a navy suit I had worn to hospital award ceremonies years ago. It was structured and simple, a reminder of the woman I had been long before this conflict began. I arrived early and sat quietly in the hallway outside the courtroom. Linda and Daniel entered together, accompanied by their attorney. Linda avoided my eyes. Daniel's jaw was tight, his posture rigid. We looked less like family and more like opposing parties in a contract dispute, which in truth was exactly what we had become. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was formal and restrained. Susan Delgado presented our case methodically. She outlined my $80,000 contribution from the sale of my Oregon home. She referenced the language of the living trust, highlighting the absence of clear beneficiary rights for me. She introduced Daniel's email stating that once the trust was restructured, I would have zero claim. She addressed the second mortgage and the transfer of assets into a limited liability company under his parents' names. Her argument centered on undue influence and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. When it was my turn to testify, I stood and faced the judge. My voice did not tremble. I explained how I had sold the only home I had known for 40 years, trusting my daughter's assurances. I admitted that I had not read every clause of the trust carefully because I believed family did not require suspicion. I spoke without accusation, simply describing events as they had unfolded. I did not cry. I did not dramatize. I stated facts. Linda took the stand next. She described the $80,000 as a voluntary gift. She said I had been fully informed and that any misunderstanding was the result of my regret, not her deception. Tears slid down her cheeks at measured intervals. She suggested that I had become increasingly controlling after moving in, that I wanted influence over decisions that belonged to her and Daniel. The performance was composed and emotional at once. Midway through the proceedings, their attorney approached Susan with a proposal for settlement. They offered $40,000 in exchange for withdrawing the complaint and agreeing not to pursue further claims. The implication was clear. If I accepted, the matter would remain contained within the family. If I refused, the court would rule publicly, and the consequences could be heavier. I sat in silence for several moments after the offer was relayed to me. $40,000 would restore half of what I had contributed. It would reduce tension, perhaps salvage something fragile between us, but it would also affirm the idea that my trust could be partially violated without full accountability. I thought about the email declaring I would have zero claim. I thought about the second mortgage that placed the entire property at risk. I realized that compromise would not restore respect. When the judge asked whether we wished to accept the settlement, I answered clearly that trust is not a blank check. I declined. The ruling came after a brief recess. The judge determined that the trust structure had failed to reflect the conditions under which my contribution was made. He ordered the nullification of the provisions, excluding me, and required reimbursement of the $80,000 plus accrued interest. He acknowledged indicators of financial exploitation under state statutes. The decision settled over the room like a final note. Linda did not look at me. In her eyes, I was no longer a mother seeking fairness, but an adversary who had chosen principle over peace. As I walked out of the courthouse, I understood that the victory carried a cost. Some choices secure justice, others secure relationships. That day, I chose justice. If you are still watching and asking yourself what you would do in this position, comment number 6 below so I know you are standing strong. Now, let us head into Chapter 7, where the consequences begin to unfold. The court's decision was final, but the silence that followed felt heavier than any argument we had endured. When we returned to the house after the ruling, no one spoke. The desert air outside was bright and indifferent, yet inside the walls everything seemed dimmed. There were no raised voices that afternoon, no dramatic confrontations. There was only a careful, brittle quiet that made every footstep echo. The order required Linda and Daniel to reimburse the full $80,000 with interest. The amount was not small, and it did not sit neatly in their savings account. Within days, I began noticing signs of strain. Daniel spent long hours on the phone in the office. I overheard fragments of conversations about refinancing and short-term loans. A luxury watch he once wore daily disappeared from his wrist. Linda stopped browsing online for new listings late at night, a habit she had previously treated as routine. Their world was tightening. Because of the asset transfer Susan had uncovered, Daniel's finances were now subject to closer scrutiny. The transfer into the limited liability company had raised questions, And even though the judge's ruling focused primarily on the trust and reimbursement, the attention from legal authorities did not simply evaporate. Daniel carried himself differently. He was no longer defensive in the loud, confident way he had been before. He seemed watchful, calculating. Arguments began to surface after dark. From the casita, I could hear raised voices through the sliding glass doors. Words blurred into tone, but blame was unmistakable. Linda accused Daniel of escalating the situation with risky financial decisions. Daniel countered that the lawsuit had forced their hand. The unity they once displayed against me fractured under pressure. They were no longer a team standing opposite me. They were two individuals trying to avoid sinking together. I remained in the casita while the financial arrangements unfolded. The court order protected my right to stay until payment was completed, and I exercised that right quietly. I did not enter the main house unless necessary. When we crossed paths in the driveway, our exchanges were limited to short acknowledgments. There was no hostility in my tone, only distance. I had nothing left to argue about. As weeks passed, partial payments were transferred under supervision of their attorney. Each transaction felt procedural, stripped of emotion. When the final amount cleared, I expected to feel triumph. Instead, I felt something closer to exhaustion. Justice had been served in a legal sense, yet the atmosphere around us remained fractured. I sometimes sat on the small patio outside the casita in the evenings, listening to the faint rustle of palm leaves in the warm breeze. I thought about the years I had spent building trust in my career, where patients relied on my competence without hesitation. Trust, once broken, does not restore itself through court orders. It requires acknowledgement, and there had been none. Linda rarely looked at me now. When she did, her gaze carried a mixture of resentment and something else I could not fully name. It was not simply anger. It was the awareness that I had chosen principle over silence. That choice had reshaped her life as much as mine. The house no longer felt like a battlefield, but it did not feel like a home either. It was a shared structure occupied by people bound by obligation rather than affection. I had won before the judge. The law had affirmed my position. Yet when I stood in the backyard at dusk and watched the desert sky darken, there was no applause, no celebration. Victory, I learned, can arrive quietly, and it can echo just as loudly as defeat. When the final reimbursement cleared into my account, I sat at the small table in the casita and stared at the numbers for a long time. $80,000, plus interest, restored in full. The transaction was complete. Legally, nothing remained unresolved. Yet the air in the backyard still felt tight, as if every breath carried residue from the months of conflict. Winning the case had secured my finances, but it had not restored warmth. I understood then that staying would only prolong something already finished. I did not announce my decision immediately. Instead, I began quietly researching communities designed for adults over 55. Sedona, Arizona, appeared repeatedly in my search results. Photographs of red rock formations rising against clear blue skies filled the screen. The landscape looked steady, ancient, unbothered by human disputes. That steadiness appealed to me more than any luxury feature could have. I drove to Sedona one weekday morning without telling Linda. The road curved gently upward, and as I approached the town, the red cliffs glowed in the sunlight like embers frozen in stone. The townhouse community I visited was modest but well-maintained. Stucco walls, small private patios, and walking paths lined with desert shrubs created an atmosphere that felt contained and calm. No grand gates, no pretense, just quiet order. The townhouse itself was smaller than the Scottsdale property, yet the space felt intentional. Sunlight streamed through large windows into a simple living room. The kitchen was compact but efficient. A single bedroom opened onto a small patio where 2 flower pots would fit comfortably. As I stood in the empty room, I noticed something unexpected. I did not feel like a guest. I felt like a future owner. When I met with the agent, I asked for every document in advance. I read each clause carefully, line by line, the way I should have read the trust months earlier. I examined the deed, confirming that the only name listed would be Margaret Whitmore. No shared structures, no layered trusts, just a straightforward purchase agreement. I refused to sign until I understood every provision. The process was slower than my previous decision to move to Scottsdale, but it was deliberate. I signed only when I felt certainty, not hope. Back at the casita, I began packing. The process was practical and unsentimental. I wrapped dishes, boxed books, and trimmed my belongings down to what I truly used. Linda did not ask where I was going. Daniel remained distant. There were no arguments, no attempts to persuade me to stay. Silence, once heavy, now felt almost cooperative. On moving day, a small truck carried my furniture north to Sedona. I stood for a moment in the empty casita before locking the door for the last time. The space echoed differently without my things inside. I did not look toward the main house. Some departures do not require ceremony. In Sedona, I arranged my furniture slowly. I placed my armchair near the window again, but this time the view held red rock instead of palm trees. I joined a local community center and enrolled in a class focused on elder financial awareness. Later, I volunteered to teach a small baking workshop once a week. The act of measuring flour and kneading dough felt grounding. For the first time in many months, I moved through rooms without calculating my presence. I opened my refrigerator without hesitation. I placed my name on the mailbox and knew it belonged there. Sedona was not an escape, it was a choice. And in that choice, I found something steadier than victory: autonomy. If you are still here and sensing that the hardest choice is not over yet, comment number 8 below to let me know you are ready for the ending. Now, let us move toward the final outcome of this story. A full year passed after I moved to Sedona. The seasons shifted subtly in the desert, marked less by temperature and more by light. I had settled into a rhythm that felt steady. On Tuesdays, I volunteered at the community center, teaching a small baking class to other retirees who preferred measuring cups to courtrooms. On Thursdays, I attended meetings about financial awareness for older adults. My townhouse remained simple, uncluttered, and unmistakably mine. I rarely thought about Scottsdale unless a certain memory surfaced unexpectedly. The call came on a quiet afternoon while I was watering 2 small pots of herbs on my patio. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but something in me hesitated before declining. I answered. Linda's voice carried a weight I recognized immediately. It was not anger this time. It was fatigue. She told me she and Daniel were divorcing. The legal fees, the financial strain, and the scrutiny that followed the asset transfers had eroded whatever foundation their marriage once had. Daniel was facing additional investigation related to his business practices. She said everything had unraveled faster than she expected. I listened without interrupting. Her words came in uneven waves. She described losing professional credibility, watching clients drift away, and realizing that the image she had worked so hard to maintain no longer held. She admitted that the pressure of the lawsuit had forced conversations she and Daniel had avoided for years. I could hear the exhaustion beneath her explanations. When she said she felt alone, something inside me tightened. For a moment, I saw the child she had been, small fingers gripping mine on her first day of school. Memory can be persuasive. It can invite you back into roles you once held without question. But I also remembered the trust document I had signed too quickly, the email stating, I would have zero claim, and the evening in the kitchen when I was told not to touch food in a house I had helped finance. Linda said, softly, that I was all she had left. The statement hung between us, fragile and loaded. A year earlier, those words might have pulled me back into automatic rescue. I had spent decades believing that motherhood meant absorbing every consequence, even those created by my child's choices. I told her I was sorry for the pain she was experiencing. I meant it. Divorce reshapes identity in ways that are difficult to anticipate. I did not dismiss her suffering, but I also told her that rebuilding our relationship would require time and honesty. I could not pretend the past had not happened. Trust, once fractured, does not restore itself through crisis. There was a long silence on the line. She did not argue. She did not accuse. She simply breathed. We ended the call without promises. Afterward, I sat in my living room and allowed the quiet to settle around me. The red rocks outside my window glowed in late afternoon light. I realized I felt neither triumph nor bitterness. I felt clarity. I could love my daughter and still refuse to abandon my own boundaries. That distinction had taken 72 years to learn. I did not intend to forget it again. Sometimes I think back to that evening in the kitchen in Scottsdale, when my daughter raised her voice and told me not to touch the food in a house I had helped finance. At the time, the words felt like humiliation. Now I understand they were a revelation. It was not about a casserole or a dinner party. It was about boundaries. It was about whether I was allowed to exist fully inside a space that carried my contribution. The legal battle that followed was never only about $80,000 or a trust document. It was about dignity. It was about recognizing that love does not require surrendering common sense. I had confused generosity with obligation for most of my adult life. I believed that being a mother meant endless accommodation, but accommodation without limits becomes erasure. In Sedona, my townhouse is modest. The furniture is simple. My name stands alone on the deed and on the mailbox. When I open the refrigerator, there is no hesitation, no calculation about whether I am overstepping. The quiet here does not feel like exclusion. It feels like ownership. I have learned that trust should never function as a blank check, even within family. Being related by blood does not remove accountability. I can love my daughter and still require honesty. I can feel compassion for her struggles and still protect my own stability. Those truths are not opposites. They are balance. Growing older has given me something I did not possess in my 40s or even my 60s. It has given me clarity. Age does not diminish worth. It sharpens it. I am no longer afraid of living alone. Solitude is far less frightening than living in a home where my presence is conditional. I did not win because a judge ruled in my favor. I won because I chose to speak when silence would have been easier. I chose to read the fine print. I chose to leave when staying would have cost me myself. No one gets to yell at me in my own home again. Not because I am hardened, but because I finally understand that my dignity is not negotiable. Tonight, as the red rocks outside my window glow in the fading light, I brew a cup of tea and sit quietly. The house is small, but the peace inside it is vast, and it belongs to me. There comes a moment in life when silence is no longer noble, and endurance is no longer strength. Sometimes the greatest act of courage is not fighting loudly, but choosing to stand calmly in your own truth. Trust is sacred, but it should never require self-erasure. Love is powerful, but it should never demand blindness. Dignity is not something granted by others. It is something claimed within. Growing older does not make a person smaller. It makes the lessons clearer. Boundaries are not walls built from bitterness. They are doors that protect peace. And peace, once chosen, becomes more valuable than approval, more comforting than validation, and more sustaining than any material victory. If this story resonated with you, thank you for being here and listening with an open heart. I would truly love to hear your thoughts. Please share your reflections in the comments and consider following and subscribing so we can continue exploring stories that matter.